Friends, welcome to the lecture on theoretical understandings of media, culture and society. This will be a two-part lecture and this is part one of the lecture series. The major ideas that we are going to discuss in this lecture would include topics such as media ideology, cultural hegemony, globalization and media, hot and cold media, and culture industry. And we will be elaborating on these ideological issues, theoretical areas with relevant examples from India and abroad as well. For your understanding, I have included in this lecture, I have tried to make this lecture quite a freewheeling one, which will include kind of a dialogic pattern. Today, we will talk about media and culture, looking at the relation between theoretical aspects of media and its role in society. Friends, media has always been perceived to be a mass influencer of human habits and notions. In the initial phase of human interaction with media, mass hysteria could be observed by way of reaction to some media events. I will just point you out in this context an incident where H.G. Wells's famous The War of the Worlds was being used as a radio drama by Orson Welles, where American listeners, when this particular episode of The War of the Worlds was being broadcasted by Columbia Broadcasting Corporation, what happened was indeed interesting. People, or rather listeners who were listening to this episode of the Martian attack on Earth, where they had landed on Earth actually, and such goes the story of the script of this episode of War of the Worlds, people believed that Martians had actually reached Earth. There was mass hysteria. This particular episode takes place in the year 1938. So this is one of the earliest examples of how media messages and audiences reacted. There was no difference between how humans perceived media messages and what constituted reality. Such examples actually are not isolated. There are quite a few examples that have taken place over the last century or so. Another example that I would like to mention in this is the case of the first screening of Lumiere Brothers' Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat in 1895. Now this was the first screening of what we call today a cinema. These were the first reels that the Lumiere Brothers would make in their series of reels when they had invented the cinematography method. Now this was screened in a hotel in Paris where a select audience was invited to come and observe what constituted moving images. The audience, when they saw the train arriving at a station on screen, believed that the train had already arrived at the screening hall. They reacted with terror, panic and fear. The initial days of communication research, thus you can well understand, mostly centered around effects research, or to categorically look at how media affected the minds and behavior of its audience. Now this is a very important point for you to remember at this point. We are talking about the initial days of the relation between audience and media messages. The initial theoretical application of cultural domination, which I will bring in now, actually was a Marxist analysis of economic class, the base and superstructure, which Antonio Gramsci developed to comprehend social class also later on. Hence, cultural hegemony proposes that the prevailing cultural norms of a society which are imposed by the ruling class, the bourgeois cultural hegemony must not be perceived as natural and inevitable, but must be recognized as artificial social constructs, institutions, practices, beliefs, etc., etc., that must be investigated to discover their philosophic roots as instruments of social class domination. That such a praxis of knowledge is indispensable for the intellectual and political liberation of the proletariat, so that the workers and peasants, the people of town and the countryside can create their own working class culture, which specifically addresses their social and economic needs as social classes. And now, I will be quoting here the British sociologist John Thomson, who in 1990 actually says, to understand ideology, dominant ideology is enforced by symbolic forms, which includes language, media, schools, religious institutions, political parties, etc., and are used by those in power to establish and sustain this relation of domination that we are talking about. So, in hindsight, what we are talking about is the power structures of society which the dominant classes want us to believe and continue in are being forwarded by the idea of a dominant ideology, and which is enforced by several institutions, as we have just talked about, and media being one of those important pillars. Ideology, therefore, becomes a necessary starting point in our understanding of media, culture, and society. Some ideologies are elevated and amplified by the mass media, given greater legitimacy by them, and distributed persuasively, often glamorously, to large audiences. When I say persuasively and glamorously, I generally am referring to, for example, to the field of advertisements, which are indeed glamorous with their celebrity quotient. Let us take the example of a very well known example, in fact, the Indian Premier League and its association with advertisements. And now, friends, you would be well aware of the fact that cricket is almost a religion in India, and the Indian Premier League has brought in a very different concept of cricket to the Indian audiences, and television in fact has greatly enriched himself with such commercial forms of cricket. Now, a Virat Kohli or a Sachin Tendulkar would want you to drink a fizzy drink, for example, let us say a Coke or a Pepsi advertisement. At the same time, the brand IPL itself is tied with a mobile brand. Now, they call it the Vivo IPL today, and a few years back, indeed, you would imagine that the IPL was called as, if I am not mistaken, the DLF IPL, so which was a real estate brand, if you remember. So, film stars, cricketing stars, and stars, celebrities of all sorts coming to our living rooms are selling various goods of all kinds during those extended breaks. You would well imagine that the cricket match itself is so designed that it can encompass all sorts of such and varied advertisements and other commercial activities. You'd see in an IPL match, for example, a lot of breaks, okay, and these breaks would not only just stand between 2 overs, but there would be breaks after every 10 overs, for example, and which are quite long breaks. So the game is in the concept of a stop and start game. This stop and start game basically lends itself to the idea of television advertisements. Now, these image systems that advertisements bring in, which are nothing but selling goods and stuffs to us, ultimately forward the message that consumption is good and here to stay. Now, this is a perfect example of capitalism marrying itself into normal sporting behavior. Now, there is nothing good or bad about it. It's only that two medias have very strongly merged into each other and created a new media culture. This ideology of consumption comes to us in a systematic pattern spread by the mass media and circulates in our familiar surroundings. This constant barrage of images that come to our living rooms today through advertisements and television is nothing but an image system which we in our familiar circles, be it our fathers and the mothers and the sisters and brothers, we all connect to and don't find it out of the ordinary. The cricket match itself, the cheerleaders, for example, advertisements both off the field and on the field, and I'm sure you would appreciate the fact that most of the advertisements in a cricket match take place on the field. Then celebrities not only in advertisements but also on the stadiums, all amalgamate together to construct a mediational image system which procreates the dominant ideology. So here I am connecting the idea of a dominant ideology and, if you understand, a cricket match, IPL. If we actually see the size of the advertisement industry in India, we will come to realize that the kind of consumption pattern that advertisements promote would be unsustainable for the nature. The kind of plastic overuse, or let's say environmental degradation, such a kind of consumption would lead to is well documented, and scientific studies abound in this area. This crass consumption culture that comes with advertisement, wherein just buying goods is the norm, we all know is an unsustainable idea in itself. So such kind of an idea, knowing very well, we accept it without questioning the advertisements. Irrespective of this knowledge, the members of the audience are turned into consumers who relate to these products in a personal way, relating to the joy, the emotional situation, fear, ecstasy, and whatnot that each advertisement wants the members of the audience to go through. So each time an advertisement is played, the members of the audience are connected to it in an individual manner, and they don't find it necessarily out of place. Consumption and cricket have really merged well, but if you think carefully, there is no connection between watching a cricket match and buying a refrigerator, for example, or a washing machine. TV, or rather television, is an agency of the established order, and as such serves primarily to extend and maintain rather than alter, threaten or weaken such conventional conceptions, beliefs and behaviors. Its chief cultural function, therefore, is to spread and stabilize social patterns. Gerbner and Gross had actually done a lot of study on this area, on the functionalities of television as a member of this dominant ideology syndrome, where the television actually not just reinforces our beliefs, but it spreads it and makes it much more concrete. Commercial advertising too not only asserts, references and reinforces preferred ideologies. For example, nationalistic rhetoric, for example, which are indulged by various advertisement houses, are commonplace to sell their goods and stuff. Using the tricolor, for example, to sell goods is a common phenomenon every Independence and Republic Day, as we have seen in our normal lives. If you take the American example, you will find various brands which actually sport the American flag on its products. Tommy Hilfiger, for example, uses shoes with the American flag on it. Now, we might not go that far, but the Indian tricolor is used in a lot of advertisements. The nationalistic fervor, the patriotic feeling of the audiences are used in a very constructive manner to sell goods and stuff. It induces in the audience a feeling of patriotism, which is utter commercial in nature. Now, that has to be kept in mind. Bashing the enemy, for example, is also a commonplace phenomenon in advertisements, and more so in films. Ridiculing Pakistan, for example, in advertisements or in our films, Bollywood I am speaking of, are self-congratulatory idioms which has been overdone. We have umpteen number of examples where we have seen that Pakistan has been used as an element to induce that patriotic fervor in our audiences, and this patriotic fervor is purely commercial in nature. I am sure you have met older generation people who opine that how the old days were better and everybody had time and culture was not affected by television and internet. In fact, I keep hearing from my grandfather how things were very different in their times, and I am sure same is the case with most of us. The older generation somehow feels that the present youth doesn't have time for interpersonal relationships. Well, those observations, if you might consider, are not just true in India but universal in nature. The spread of modern communication technologies to every nook and corner has indeed resulted in far-reaching effects, which we are trying to understand in this lecture through ideology. Media is just not a container, but itself a subjective, a interpretative, ideological form. I will repeat, media is not just a container. It is itself a subjective, interpretative, ideological form in itself. With the spread of media, let's say Disney characters, which we find very common with kids today, which were at one point in time very unique to only, let's say, North American kids, became popular to kids in most societies across the world. and rather posing challenges, these Disney characters, to all those indigenous characters or heroes, those were present in the folklore of those societies. I am sure you would have come across a Mickey Mouse and a Donald Duck in the cartoons present everywhere. These are uniquely American. Yet, kids of all kinds, in all countries, across cultures, are hooked to those Disney characters. Let's take the example of Michael Jackson. Now, people of my age group would have grown up on the music of Michael Jackson. He became a worldwide sensation by virtue of his song and dance skills. A generation of Indian youths like me would be seen copying their dance moves and his mannerisms. I am sure you would remember his famous moonwalk and how it became a rage among the youth at that point in time. You would have seen even kids copying mannerisms of their favorite cartoon characters in their daily lives, or imitating the style and the behavior of the cartoon character. Let's take a recent example. Japanese cartoons have become quite popular of late in India. I'm sure you would have kids at home who would be watching those Japanese cartoons. I have noticed kids who imitate a character called Shin-chan or a Ninja Hattori in their pastime. Kids talking to themselves in the language of those cartoon characters. Now, this is indeed something to take note of here. This is nothing but the ideological representations through mass media which are actively used by the members of the audience in their daily construction of reality. Now, the kid for sure doesn't know the difference between a cartoon character and his real life, but we adults sure do know what we mean by it. But I am sure you would have seen youths copying the hairstyle from their favorite heroes or copying the dress patterns of the latest fashionista. Now, we are recreating our daily realities based on media messages. Let's take some other examples from daily advertisements in our lives. I'm sure you have come across phrases such as Dil Mange More or Yahi Hai Right Choice Baby being used in daily vocabularies of people around you. Who can forget the recent movie Uri, the surgical strike, and the phrase, "How's the Josh?" Now, the fact that this phrase has become such a rage among the people of the country would also tell you that mass media messages are actively used by members of the audience to construct their daily realities. And this is something we cannot just while away. It is in this context, it is important to mention that Harold Innis, one of the most important Canadian communication scholars, warned of the dangers that he thought modern communication technologies will bring about. On the other hand, Marshall McLuhan, another remarkable scholar, also a Canadian colleague of Harold Innis, gave more importance to the idea of form and not the content of the media. We will talk about Marshall McLuhan, of course, in this lecture, but it in details later on further down this lecture. Mass media has affected cultural settings across the world in more ways than one that we can imagine of. Media enters the traditional settings cultural values, norms, styles, and challenges this set values, transforms and realigns with the domestic forces, creating new meanings. If you minutely observe what I have just said, I mean that media actually doesn't necessarily create a new cultural setting, but rather it enters the old settings and reorders the power structures, ideological structures. In a study conducted by the Indian scholar Nina Bahel in 1988, she looked at the ways in which the introduction of television into Indian households actually changed the way that the Indian society constructed itself around the living rooms. She found out that television had brought about drastic changes. The man-woman relationship, for example, had undergone a change. The women were taking control of the remote and doing so of their lives as well. The young and the old bonded over television programming in the living room. They would be sitting together watching programs. The household activities would center around the act of watching television. For example, let's say the dinner timings would be adjusted with the timing of the favorite television program. Now, this is a very interesting study which actually shows us ways in which mass media and messages affected the structures of the Indian society. And not to speak of, we haven't yet spoken about how the media systems affect cultures elsewhere. Familial ties, gender relations, societal relations have all been transformed in numerous societies, as shown in researches where such studies have been conducted across the world. To understand this concept a little better, I will now introduce to you the concept of globalization at this point. Two of the most important factors that contributed to globalization are the advancement of transportation technologies and secondly, media and communication technologies. While traditional societies were confined to their villages or at best the next two, because the mode of transport made it impossible for most people to travel, the smaller communities were more compact in nature and would remain confined to their own distinct cultures. But with the advancement of transportation technologies and faster means of transport, what we see is that the travel time between two places have grown faster. We have seen the introduction of faster planes such as the Concorde, which made transatlantic travel quite fast. We saw the introduction of bullet trains in countries such as France and Japan. That has brought land travel to such an extreme pace that we still haven't yet had a second bullet train in India. Long distance passenger planes have made it possible for people to travel non-stop to the extreme end of the world. This has made people lives easier because for fun, for work or for pleasure, traveling across the world has become much more easier and economical. Thus, it is not out of the ordinary to see people traveling long distances in search of work, both within the country and abroad as well. I would suggest to you this large-scale migration that we see from Bihar to the agricultural fields of Punjab, let's say. While immigration of people from Kerala to the Middle East in search of work is a case of cross-border travel. Every year during the monsoon season, we see hundreds and thousands of workers travel across India to different parts in search of jobs, in search for better opportunities. Now, this is not only true for India. We have seen Indians going abroad and settling down, like the Middle East case. Indian nurses are the mainstay of the health sector in the Middle East. You will find foreign players playing in the professional sporting leagues of India, such as IPL, the Badminton League, the Kabaddi League, and whatnot. Indian software professionals are everywhere today, especially in the North Americas, where most technological firms are located. The global flow of tourists have increased exponentially as a result of this. And many small island nations, if you have observed, depend solely on tourists for their economy. I would just make a few cases for you, such as the example of, let's say, Maldives, the Mauritius, the Seychelles Islands. These islands depend, their whole economies depend on the idea of flow of tourists. With faster transportation, thus, the world has indeed become a smaller place. The proliferation of media and communication technologies towards the later part of the 20th century has resulted in a different sort of globalization. The rise in satellites beaming programming across the globe has made media immediate and global. The coming of digital media and internet is another case in point of technologies making the world a smaller place. Marshall McLuhan defines media into two broad categories, the hot and the cold media, based on their inherent characteristics. He opined that each technology defined the time and the space conundrum based on its characteristics. Hot media, for example, are the traditional forms of media which did not have the luxury of a feedback system. So, if you would realize, hot media would be those traditional forms wherein the audience could not revert back to the producers, and that's why they are called as hot media. By cold media, Marshall McLuhan would mean modern communication technologies that had inherent feedback system, which resultantly made the world a colder place, a shrunk space. Hot media means expansion. The world grows apart. Cold media means implosion. It's just the opposite of explosion. It implodes within itself. The world growing smaller, a global village, as McLuhan termed this concept. This new imploding world rapidly increased the pace of globalizing forces to galvanize the globe into a single entity. While globalization might be understood in economic terms, it is not only economic in nature. Globalization also meant the transfer of images and information from one part of the globe to another at a pace never seen before. And all this was possible only because of this influx of media and communication technologies in the later part of the 20th century. Yes, indeed, you can say economic globalization had started quite early. Probably the history of colonial India might also be termed as a process of economic globalization, but that would also be hiding the various other ways in which British culture came into contact with India and affected it, and vice versa. The communication technologies, you might argue, have just increased the pace of this process. It is because of the forces of globalization that you see soap operas which run simultaneously in multiple countries, in multiple languages. Indian Idol, for example, The Voice, for example, or if you remember the Hindi serial called Jassi Jaisi Koi Nahi, are few examples of Indian television programs which are essentially foreign programming fine-tuned for the taste of Indian audiences. Jassi Jaisi Koi Nahi is an adaptation, for example, of a hugely successful soap titled Ugly Betty, which has been adapted for more than 80 countries. The essence is a global culture which tries to be homogeneous. Yet, interestingly so, the local always finds a way to harmonize the local and the global, which might be termed as the glocal. Chinese food, for example, let's take this example, is a common fast food item in India, which is essentially quite different from authentic Chinese fare and includes a lot of Indian spices. I'm sure you have come across other global food chains that operate in India, for example, a KFC or the McDonald's pizza chains, which have introduced, rather interestingly, localized food items, such as their importance to vegetarian fast food fare. Now, this is something which is unique to India. This is a perfect example of a localized food. Hip hop in Punjabi music is another revolutionary concept. We have seen it go beyond the boundaries of the country and is popular almost many parts of the world, including the non-resident Indian communities. This is a perfect example, hip hop and Punjabi music, of a localized culture which is a mix of two cultures which are thousands of miles apart. English movies dubbed in Hindi are more popular sometimes than many of our Hindi films. The film Avatar, for example, was a global hit and earned not only in America but also in India and China. Likewise, Amir Khan's Dangal became a super hit in China. Audiences who connected with the theme probably were more in China than in India. Who knows? Cultures mix and combine in unique ways and give rise to hybrid notions of culture that take the best of both the world. The initial fear that globalization would sweep, all indigenous cultures and make the world into a large America of sorts came out unfounded. Everybody would just fear that the American Rambo movies would just wipe away all East Asian movies, but it never happened. Probably those indigenous cultures have reached out to the world today by way of digital media. America, as the center of the globalization debate, therefore, has long been negated. That the world after the Cold War no longer has a single superpower but a web of power structures where each culture is important has been established today. The world now realizes the importance of large economies such as Brazil, South Africa, and India. China, Germany, Japan all have their legitimate place in the globalization debate today. The idea of cultural hegemony states that developed nations dominate the media around the world, which in return has a powerful effect on third world cultures by imposing on them Western views and therefore destroying their native cultures. There is an imbalance of flow of information where Western civilizations produce the majority of media, films, news, comics, and so on and so forth. This sort of media imperialism is augmented by the fact that majority of media today is held by few large corporations for whom making media is nothing more than a profit-making venture. If we really do an analysis of the big media around us and the other technological firms that we see around us, we will notice that at best there are only 8 to 10 firms which own a majority of them. And indeed, most of these firms are located in the West. Large corporate media firms who work as a big assembly line production of entertainment goods to be sold to the unsuspecting public. As a result, most of the programs that we see today are nothing more than just a rehash of some other program in some other part of the world. Everything works here according to a formula where creativity is the last concern. These media are also called the culture industry, originally coined by the scholars from the Frankfurt School of Thought, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, and was presented as a critical vocabulary in The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, which was part of the book called Dialectics of Enlightenment, published in the year 1944, wherein they proposed that popular culture is akin to a factory producing standardized cultural goods. Films, radio, magazines, all are used to manipulate mass society into a state where they become dominant modes of entertainment. You have to remember here that the time the Frankfurt School was writing, the assembly line production system in America was a reality, and most of Europe and the Americas had already become an industrial society. Germany was fast producing some of the most deadly weapons and inventions of mass destruction. Hitler was at his peak. Standardized methods of production had taken over everyone's imagination. Every product that was produced looked exactly the copy of the earlier one and came in the same packaging too. Even films and media were also not untouched by this phenomena. Both the scholars, Adorno and Horkheimer, argue that advertisement had become a pseudo technique by now, which fooled people, in essence, into buying stuffs they don't need. They induced false demands in the minds of the consumers. People became consumers although they knew that the tall promises made in these advertisements are false and misleading most of the time. As you'd appreciate the fact in India that there is a body called the Advertising Standards Council of India, ASCI, which prohibits every year many such advertisements because they are misleading in nature. A good example here to cite would be how fairness creams are sold on the notion that to be fair is beautiful. Such problematic assertions not only induce false cultural notions among the youth but also create demand for a product in a very questionable manner. Such kinds of advertisements are prohibited from time to time. Consumptions of the easy pleasures of popular culture made available by mass communications media renders people docile and content no matter how difficult their economic circumstances. Although the Frankfurt School deemed the audience as sitting lame ducks, scholars such as Dennis McQuail have negated this view. He was of the opinion that audiences today are immune to the stimulations of media and receive messages in a much more critical manner, guided by his or her own social and cultural context. The inherent danger of the culture industry is the cultivation of false psychological needs that can only be met and satisfied by the products of capitalism and in turn the culture industry. With the turn of the industrial society, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that leisure has come to be a major factor in the lives of the masses, and people had no option but to turn to the culture industry for solace. They argue that the American movie industry, for example, which is one of the earliest organized form of culture industry with its studio system, strives only for profits, and in this endeavor they repeat the same formula time and over again. Creativity takes a backseat, and it's in permutation and combination of the same tricks that the industry carries out, earning profits. Originality has never been the trademark of the culture industry. Of course, here you might argue that movie industries across the world now rely on the same trick, including our very own Hindi film industry. Take the example, let us look at few examples from Bollywood, where irrespective of the impressive number of films that we make each year, probably the highest in the world as they say, we still only have a handful of films which are recognized as good globally. how often have you come across a Hindi film being nominated for an Oscars, if you consider Oscars as the yardstick for creativity, let's say. The theory that Hindi masala films sell is an adage that has remained true even today. A successful Hindi film has to have songs, romance, a little bit of action, tragedy, and so on. Every other song today, for example, if you pick up a Hindi film or an independent soundtrack today, is repetitive or a mishmash of some old song that you have heard long time back. Most of the times it's remix. Creativity in culture industry therefore is at a premium. Friends, in this lecture today, we have looked at concepts like media ideology, cultural hegemony, globalization and media, hot and cold media, culture industry in details. While these concepts are global in perspective, I have in today's lecture tried to look at this with relevant examples from our local idiom. Some other important concepts in the same series of lecture will be touched upon in part 2 of this lecture. Thank you and goodbye.